This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Shakhriyar Mamedyarov taking on Magnus Carlsen at the 2010 World Blitz Championship. And the game starts out with a Nimzo Indian, Queen's Indian rather, opening, and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov fianchettoing his kingside bishop c8 to a6, which is totally standard fare these days. You can see how casually Magnus executing the first moves. This is all theory. Bishop b4, check, bishop d2, and c7, c5. Magnus basically says, okay, I'm down to trade dark squared bishop, but I'm only going to do it on my terms. And that c5 pawn is clamping down on the b1 knight, not allowing it to develop to its natural square on c3. And so Shakhriyar Mamedyarov tries to take that b4 pawn off the board with the move a3, and he castles kingside, and Magnus does the same. And now the big question is, will white take on b4, or will white allow black to be the one to take on a3? The position looks pretty equal. Magnus has played instantly so far. He's got over 3 minutes on his clock, and Shakhriyar brings his queen up to d2, attacking the pawn on b4 and trying to force Magnus to be the one to trade the pawn on a3. Now, will Magnus play queen e7? Will he play knight e4 and attack the queen on d2? There's a lot of different choices here for black. So far, the position looks very, very quiet. Not much has happened. Both sides have castled to a safe spot, and Magnus does decide on the move queen d8 to e7. And one of the ideas behind this could be to deploy the knight on a6. If Shakhriyar takes on b4, that knight is going to jump into the game via b4, and later on you could support that knight by playing a7, a5. So it's a battle of who can get the other side to take that pawn first, and well, we know who's won that battle, and Magnus has gotten his knight into b4, and it's not such a big deal. Shakhriyar's position still looks totally fine, and he develops his knight to c3. And now will Magnus continue chipping away at the center? No, first he plays the move knight f6 to e4, forcing another pair of minor pieces off the board. But look at how he's worming his way into white's position, and another trade. And his minor pieces, his bishop on e4, his knight on b4, both of those pieces look very, very well positioned. And Mamedyarov continues to force pieces off the board. We now have a trade of bishops, and there's only a pair of knights remaining on the board. And Magnus decides to secure his knight by playing a7, a5. And Mamedyarov grabs control of the center, and he pushes his e4 pawn, his e2 pawn up the board to e4. And this is a pretty classic scenario. Black often gives up control of the center in this opening. That's not necessarily a problem because there are so few pieces left on the board. The move d6 by Magnus chases Shakhriyar's Mamedyarov's knight out of the center, and the knight drops back to f3. And now the pawn on e4, will it be attacked by a queen from e7 to b7? How is Magnus going to arrange his rooks? And there's our answer. He plays the move rook a8 to c8. And for now, the rook is just staring at that pawn on c4. But later on, we could envision a scenario where Magnus pushes his b pawn up the board, or maybe even his d pawn, and opens up the c file. So Shakhriyar cannot fall asleep on that scenario. And speaking of not falling asleep, there goes Shakhriyar's h pawn. He is not just going to dilly-dally around. He's going to push that h pawn perhaps all the way up to h6 in order to provoke weaknesses on black's king side. And a quick glance up at the crowd of spectators that always gathers around Magnus Carlsen's game anytime he plays anywhere. And there's queen e7 to b7, that move attacking the pawn on e4 and x-raying the knight on f3. And one move that Shakhriyar has to be a little bit careful about is f7, f5, because with the queen x-raying the knight, when the king sitting in the queen's diagonal, that move could be pretty scary. And I think that's why Shakhriyar just played the move he did. He plays d4, d5, putting a lot more weight between the queen and the knight, putting an entire pawn that is defended by two other pawns in front of the queen. But is he going to bite off more than he can chew? Can Magnus take on d5, for example, and play the move b5 to chip away at white's center? That is what Magnus must be thinking about, and he's down to a minute and a half on his clock, and a big decision to be made here. How is black going to resolve the central tension, or will he resolve it at all? And the answer, he will not resolve it at all. He plays rook f to e8, and he kind of invites white to be the one to take on e6, but that will weaken the e4 pawn. So Magnus tries to keep the tension, and it's Shakhriyar's best interest to keep the tension as well. And keep the tension he does. He swings the knight from f3 to d4, and the knight heading toward the outpost on b5. What is it going to be doing on b5? Well, it's going to be attacking the d6 pawn, which Magnus is going to have to delegate a heavy piece in order to defend. And so Magnus drags his own knight back from b4. Hey, you've done your job. Now he heads for c5, and Shakhriyar has two of those pawn weaknesses that he has to be very careful about. There's a pawn on b3. That's backward. There is a pawn on e4 that is going to be undefended, and it's going to be hanging if Black's knight reaches c5, and Shakhriyar's clock reaches a minute, and it's time for him to move, and he continues to move his h-pawn down the board, and Magnus stops it in its tracks with h6, rook h1 for Shakhriyar. I think he's trying to get his rook to h4, and that is exactly what he does, but isn't there the move e5? Oh my goodness, the move e5 forces the knight out of d4, and the pawn on b3 is actually hanging with a fork. Magnus doesn't do that. Instead, he takes on d5 and moves his rook up to e5, and Shakhriyar has to be very, very careful not to blunder the pawn on b3, because if he blunders it, he also blunders a fork. And how is Mamedyarov going to continue assembling his pieces on the king side? Magnus has control of that open e-file, and that could be really unpleasant. His rooks could eventually sink their teeth into the e2 square. And you can see one of the spectators there behind Magnus looking over at the clock, and Mamedyarov has 30 seconds left on that clock, and he's got to move, and he moves the knight back to f3, and he's blundered b3. Or has he blundered b3? Does he see that Magnus can take on b3 with a fork? And Magnus, you can see the surprise on his face. Knight takes b3, attacks the queen, attacks the rook on a1, and even though his own rook on e5 is hanging, I don't think it matters. I think his knight massacres White's entire queenside, and there he is, taking on b3. And you can see by Shakhriyar's reaction that he completely forgot that pawn was hanging. And a shake of his head, and Mamedyarov got nervous looking over at his clock, forgetting that his pawn was hanging with a fork, and there is not much he can do here if he moves his queen. Magnus simply takes the rook on a1, and at best, White is going to be down a full piece, and there's knight takes a1. Mamedyarov shaking his head after a devastating blunder. Last-ditch attempt here, rook g4. Magnus still can't relax. Queen takes h6 is being threatened, and Black's king is not totally out of the woods. Magnus taking his remaining time and bringing his queen very carefully to d7. An excellent defensive move, making contact with the rook on g4, and Mamedyarov is running out of options, and he is running out of time, and he resigns the game. And an unfortunate blunder, but Magnus Carlsen is the hero in that game. And if you want more videos like this, make sure to click the link in the playlist. Thank you so much for watching.